So there's this channel that kept popping up on my channel's recommendation list. It's called Black Pigeon Speaks. And from what I can discern, he's kind of a right-leaning or kind of an extreme right-winger. He makes videos attacking SJWs. Some of them, they were good. But he made a video, this has been a month ago, how women destroy nations, and I think he also made a follow-up. Honestly, it's pretty bad. V has already made several responses to this, so I want to keep this short and sweet. But I do want to mention that it's quite disturbing to me that this video was really well received for an extreme right opinion. I mean, really, the arguments that's been made in this video, it's like V said, it's really just what it's a counterpart of what feminists' arguments are against men. But he makes similar arguments, but this time it's against women. I guess I shouldn't be surprised about this because, you know, I blame the extreme leftist and the SJWs and the feminists who are kind of censoring free speech, censoring all opposition sides and all of that. So YouTube is kind of like the forum for people who are like anti-feminists, anti-SJWs, and so a lot of right-wingers, they flock to YouTube or like I don't want to say safe space, but you know, to freely express their opinion, and I fully support it. I mean, I support free speech. It doesn't matter if they're extreme left, extreme right, middle, which is, in my opinion, the most objective you can get. So yeah, and it was really disturbing to me that V's video rebuttal was not very well received in comparison. So, I'm not going to do the video frame by frame kind of thing because V already done that. I'm just going to point out a few things to try to stick to his main thesis, which is that women, they have some ingrained biological nature that would invite multiculturalism. And they're one of the 5 major causes, according to Black Pigeon Speaks, of this migrant crisis that's been going on in Europe. This is like his words, not mine. You can go listen to the debate between Black Pigeon Speaks and V, link down below. And so he's kind of saying that women's sexuality needs to be controlled, but I mean relative to men. So men's sexuality doesn't need to be controlled as much as women's sexuality for some reason. Okay. And his underlying thesis is that if women are given too much liberty, too much freedom, especially sexual freedom, then they would undermine society in some way. This part is not very clear to me. And because of women's nature of being emotional, you know, sort of doing things out of emotion and sympathy rather than reason and logic, this is why there's a migrant crisis. So this is from what I understand.
Women do not on an instinctual level care very much about her tribe, nation, or civilization. It's in their nature not to.
Okay, so right off the back, his main thesis, which I stated before, is that it's not in the woman's nature to be loyal to her tribe, which is kind of interesting. I mean, given the fact that most traitors historically have been male. But I guess this is just an inconvenient fact. Well, I mean, if you watch the debate between V and Black Pigeon Speaks, you actually see that the V brings out a lot of inconvenient facts, and Black Pigeon just sort of hand waving it, kind of like, well, actually, this can be explained by this reason. This is an exception. Pretty much everything V brings up is an exception. He's talking about the trend, and V asks, well, what do you mean by the trend? I mean, what is the trend? And he says, well, a lot, and he doesn't give any percentages. But maybe this fact that I'm bringing up, people are going to say, many, if not most of those traitors are influenced by women, even though this is, I mean, there are no evidence for that. I mean, some probably are, but some aren't. And female traitors, you can argue the same, probably influenced by their husbands, their fathers, to do, traitorous things. So, yeah, I mean, both men and women's biology can lead to betraying their tribe if it benefits them, which is something V already brought up. But I just want to bring up this point, too.
It's just that women have never been the builders of any of the larger edifices of civilization and are not.
Well, like somebody has said, there is a special place in hell for anybody who uses the word never or always. Okay, well, what about the Chinese Empress Wu Zetian for one? She actually started her own dynasty, and because she doesn't trust anybody, so she made up this system in which anybody could secretly give her information on another person directly. But I guess Black Pigeon would say that, well, her accomplishments were on the shoulders of men, because, when a founder of civilization, empire, dynasty, or nation is attributed mainly to a man, no women played a part in it. Well, just another fun fact. Although the establishment of the Chinese national identity was attributed to Sun Yat-sen, like I've said in my China and Tibet video, his wife, Song Qinling, was actually a prominent figure to push the establishment through, as well as holding several prominent positions in the new communist government. Which was why she was called the mother of modern China. Her sister, Song Meiling, who was the wife of Chiang Kai-shek, I'm sure many of you know who that is, she played one of the leading roles in repelling the Japanese during World War II. Together with Song Ailing, who was the wife of the richest man in the early 20th century of the Republic of China, they were together known as the Three Song Sisters, three pivotal women who were among the main founders of both the Republic and the People's Republic of China. But sure, according to Black Pigeon Speaks, women have never, in his words, been the builder of civilizations. Of course.
And let's get this out in the open. Women are not very good at being loyal to the tribe. They never have been, they never will be. The reason is it's not in their nature to do so. Women throughout history have shown time and time again they're quick to seek the favors of men they feel are stronger and more dominant, whether they're part of their in-group or not. Recent examples of this, besides Japanese or Vietnamese war brides.
From all of the statistics that this has been given about, there's a huge number of women who would marry foreigners, basically, the people who come into their country, but they're foreigners. It's a very small percentage, estimated not even 1%, pretty much, of total. Depends on how you estimate it. For example, it's been shown that 30,000 Japanese women married American men. That's 30,000 out of, a population during that time of 70 million, and half of 70 million, assuming that half of them are women, even though most likely not, probably a majority of them are women, because, the men went in war and freaking died. There was probably a shortage of men. It would be 35 million, and if you break that down even further, of the young adults, the eligible adult women who are ripe for marriage, it would have been between 50 to 60%. Generally, that's how many adults there are in society. So then you get something like 20 million. And if you just do the math, you'll see that it's something like 0.14, at most 0.2% of the women who went and married an American man. And this is also perfectly understandable too. I mean, despite the fact that it's like a negligible percentage of women who did this, but it's also understandable why there would be women who go off and marry American or other ethnic group. And, you know, like I said, it's because there were probably a shortage of men. So basically, this is where Black Pigeon speaking will say, well, you know, I would not disagree with you on that. I'm just saying under certain circumstances, women would do this. Well, bloody fucking dud. I mean, men would do it too. If there were a shortage of women, men would also be desperate. You know, if there were enough shortage of women, men would be desperate enough to look elsewhere. So if you have a shortage of women, for some reason, maybe there's like a disease that only hit women or something, and if there were foreign women coming to their country, do you not think that men would try to marry many of them? Of course. In fact, right now this is the problem in China, in places like China, because there are now a shortage of women due to the culture preference of sons and what is more complicated. Basically, there's a preference for sons culture in China, and after they put on a one-child policy, and the one-child policy really only applied to the urban areas, but in the rural it's like a two-child policy. There are now a shortage of women because they're being actively aborted and people just or abandoned, but mostly probably aborted. So what do these men do? Well, I mean, if they could get out of their village and work in urban areas, which is what a lot of these men do because they can find work in urban areas, they would try to find a wife from the city. But of course, this is usually not successful, as in urban city girls are more educated and their family would freaking have a problem with it, right? So these men would then resort to sex trafficking. So this has been a huge problem in China of basically single women walking down the street and they got abducted and then they are sold to the highest bidder of these village men for sex or for wife or for whatever. So yeah, I mean, the Chinese government is really cracking down on these sex traffickers, but this will be a problem for quite a while. So yeah, men are not just staying around and you know, not marry if there's a shortage of women. I mean, men have a much higher sex drive. I know maybe people will contest with me on that, but anyways, it's kind of like, for them, sex is more of a constant thing, whereas for women, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and the sex is almost like food for men, so they definitely need something to fuck. And right now in China, because of also the fact that the porn is kind of banned, yeah, I mean, sympathy to the men, but this is what happens.
Now, not only are women not punished for inviting alien and unassimilatable armies of men into the West, they then vote for parties that force the entire society to have its national wealth redistributed to this army of aggressive and hostile men.
So this claim that women tend to vote for the left relative to the right has been from a study that showed that 54% of the women voted for Al Gore, whereas 53% of the men voted for Bush. I mean, as it has already been pointed out, this is just one isolated case. I have looked at when for Obama, it showed that 56% of the white women voted for Romney, 42 voted for Obama, but 62% of the white men voted for Romney and 35% voted for Obama. There are no longitudinal data that I can find on this, and I would expect it to fluctuate I would expect that, some eras, more women vote for conservative or just as conservatively as men do, and others they vote more liberal.
And even though women can take steps to protect themselves, the primary responsibility for protection will probably always belong to men. This is very important. Women will thus only have as much freedom as their men are willing or capable of guaranteeing them.
I would disagree with this. While it's true that past societies have tried to control women's sexuality, they have also tried to control men's. Women's sexuality has been controlled a bit more, it's true. So, if a woman commits adultery, the society tends to make her suffer heavier consequences than if a man commits adultery. But this is due to the fact that past societies didn't have the technology to accurately determine the father of the child, as we do now. Whereas for women, back then, as long as the child is squeezed out of her vagina, the child was hers. And because the man was always the entirely financially responsible party for both the woman and the children, the society helped the men a little bit more by cracking down on women more for being chaste. However, men were also financially responsible for children being born out of wedlocks, and many men cheated. But depending on the judgment of the authority, they might let the man off easier if they decide that there was no adequate proof that the child is his. But we don't have these issues in the modern society. So it's quite a thing to say that as long as the woman is being made to be chaste, that would solve the problem of raising children. Would men be just satisfied with a woman that he's with simply because she's chaste? What if this woman is a fat, ugly bitch who gives terrible sex to her husband, who, as the vast majority of young men, thinks about sex every 2 seconds? But she's pure, faithful, and chaste. Do you think that he would just stay put? And if some woman from another tribe comes along who is beautiful and available and awesome at sex, that this man wouldn't fuck her instead of his wife? If you are giving privilege to bias in favor any group, whether it's men, women, whites, blacks, elderly, minors, gays, transgenders, disabled, vegan, I don't know, people wearing green shirts, what have you, people will take advantage of it, and people will become selfish, and the inequality would make society suffer.
So the question begs, why do women do this? Why do women betray their in-group? And how is the current situation different from those that preceded it? Well, in a word, enfranchisement. Women have been given the vote, and in a democratic society, they vote their biological imperative. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, recent genetic research has shown that before the modern era, 80% of women managed to reproduce while only 40% of men did.
So I have read this article that Black Pigeon cites, and the article does not state that this 80-40 rule observation only came from Western civilizations, so I would assume that it came from all major civilizations. So then this is reasonable. It shows that, among other things, we are a polygamous bunch. Just like many, if not most, mammals. Certainly our closest ancestors are polygamous. There are also other factors such as men would often go to war, so there will be a constant shortage of men probably. And the strongest men tend to survive until they would produce offspring. But let's just say that this has been taken into consideration already, and it really is the case that, generally speaking, 40% of men tend to, on the average, produce offspring with 2 women, historically speaking. This is not unreasonable. And yes, this does mean that, on the average, men are at a disadvantage relative to women, from this perspective. So from this perspective, women do have female privilege. They have it easier to get sexual partners than men do. That's why women are pickier, and this has been supported by many studies. And because of this, I understand why so many men are therefore very frustrated because it's like you're constantly having to eat with a picky eater and you're the ones who has to provide the food, right? But then Black Pigeon thesis is then because when more women are likely to share male partners, they somehow are more likely to be willing to find partners from other tribes than men are. Even though all this really, there isn't really a solid connection between the two. But let's just say that there is. What this means is that then also, while more women are willing to find partners from outside of their tribes, they also tend to do it less frequently. On the other hand, less number of men are willing to find partners from outside of their tribe. I mean, well, they don't really have a choice. But then for those that do, they would also do it more frequently. So then when you're talking about restricting sexual behaviors, based on this number, you would then need to restrict more number of women, but then you would need to have a stronger restriction on men's sexual behavior. So it would be like one of those choosing between, do I want to have more frequent accidents but less harmful ones, or do I want to have less frequent accidents, but then those accidents I do have tend to be more seriously harmful ones? Decisions.
Laid at the feet of loosening of sexual morality and the dating habits of young women. Colloquially called the 80-20 rule, what it basically means is that the vast majority, the 80%, are sexually pursuing the top 20% of men. This is highly damaging to the formation of monogamous couples and the successful formation of families.
I have tried to find this 80-20 rule on the internet when it comes to dating. What I found was that what is called so-called the 80-20 rule really is like a principal factor sparsity. Basically, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. But from what I read in terms of relationships and dating, it's a little bit shaky. There's no conclusive evidence showing that really 80% of women will go for 20% of men. And you know, the genetic study that he previously cited showed that at most 80% of women would go for 40% of the men, not the 20%. And then if you take all different factors into account that would interact with it, it's not certain what the actual percentage is. But let's just say that this is true, even though I tend to think that this is highly exaggerated. Black Pigeon said that this polygamous relationship thing would be what's destroying monogamous marriage. Well, like I have said in my other videos, monogamous relationships have been historically exclusively Western. No other major civilizations I can think of had a legal monogamous marriage where any man can only have one wife. And like I said before, this was one of the main reasons that eventually led to feminism in the West, because women were just held in much higher esteem historically in the West than women from other civilizations. Monogamous marriage was then adopted by other civilizations based on the Western model. But what this means is that many polygamous civilizations in the past had thrived for quite a long time. You know, like China, the Ottoman Empire, Egyptian Empire, other major African kingdoms, the Middle East, you name it. Many thrived for thousands of years. So I really don't see the connection here. Again, it's quite a big claim that if we give freedoms so we can go by the quote-unquote the natural tendencies, specifically on the part of the women, societies would fall. I don't think there is any evidence for that if you really look deep into history.
The feminization of men in the West, adhering to the repetitive and decades-long diatribe that vilifies anything and all things masculine, are no longer, for many women, attractive potential mates.
Why no longer? Would they ever? You could argue that the feminization of men means men becoming more gentle. You know, where the term gentleman comes from. The characteristics of being gentle has been stereotypically a feminine trait. Even Dan Barker has said that in some Native American tribes, a man becoming like women is a positive statement. It means that the man becoming less of a brute, as Europeans observe about other so-called primitive cultures during, for example, the 19th century. So men becoming less warlike, more sympathetic, and caring about others, and make decisions more calmly instead of going with their impulses all the time. Yeah, shocker. Men can think with their emotions too. And this has been one of the arguments directed against women in terms of women's nature, that we tend to think based on emotions instead of reason. It's actually more complicated than that. Many current cognitive models have suggested that emotions cannot be separated from thinking. Some even suggested that it has always been emotions that drive thinking. In terms of men versus women, women are more frequent to use emotion when thinking, but they're also better at regulating emotion and keeping bad emotions at bay. On the other hand, men are less frequent at using emotion when thinking, but at the same time, they also tend to be worse at regulating emotion. So that's why men tend to be more impulsive, other than being more rational. And men are extremist, from all sorts of aspects, like intelligence, creativity, leadership, you name it. The distribution of these things with respect to men tend to be flatter. So the best and the worst ones tend to be men. So from this perspective, most of the time, men and women average out on a lot of this stuff, such as rational thinking. So you can have men who think like machines and completely apathetic to anything, and you can have men who explode like volcanoes, completely doing things just because he feels like it. The problem with all these left versus right wars has been the fact that people are just lazy thinkers, unfortunately. That's why they like the extremes, and the shifts in the extremes happen so frequently. Black Pigeon is also a lazy thinker from what I've seen, at least with this video. Everything that goes on in the world is the result of complicated multi-factor issues that many times so tightly interact with each other that they cannot be separated into causes and effects. It's really like the question who came first, the chicken or the egg. But really, no more. We can no longer afford to be lazy thinkers, not with all these technological advancements at our disposal, not with the world becoming smaller and more interactive. We have to become wiser. If not, that's how societies will fall.
Out of the way because I have a feeling it might show up in the comments. Yes, I am aware that the vast majority of women, when raped, reach sexual climax or orgasm.
I also looked this up because I find this claim highly questionable. And what I found is that they say that the vast majority of the women who experienced quote-unquote sexual attack orgasmed during the experience. And this is from transcripts of counseling sessions. So this is highly questionable because it depends on what you mean by rape and how you define rape. I think our culture encourages women to report any kind of sex that wasn't explicitly expressed by the woman as consensual to be called rape. So imagine if you have two partners living together for a while, and occasionally the guy will go to the kitchen or wherever the woman is, grabs her and shoves her to the table, bend her over, pull down her pants, and fucks her, right? And then she orgasms. Well, I wouldn't be surprised that most women would call this rape with orgasm, because the guy probably would do this kind of thing because he already knows that the woman likes it to begin with. So this is kind of like the Cersei Lannister kind of rape, right? But on the other hand, if you have some random guy who breaks in, or let's say he goes to an alleyway and grabs a woman, he violently throws her on the ground, putting a knife at her throat or gun on her head, and he tells her that if she doesn't play along nicely, she would be killed. You know, basically the clone kind of rape. I don't understand why they didn't do a study on those victims. But anyways, I would call that the serious kind, and I would actually say that this kind of scenario should actually be the definition of rape. And in that situation, I would sincerely doubt that most women would orgasm during the experience. This is because women's sexuality in terms of reaching orgasm is much more complicated than that of men's. It's much, much harder to come for women than it is for men. In fact, this is one of the reasons that women often fake sex, so at least the men would enjoy it. And since for many men, sex is sort of like the deal breaker for whether he stays with a woman or not, you know, women found a strategy to keep their men around. So they do this even though many more women relative to men, would never orgasm during intercourse in her lifetime. So this is why it's really doubtful that they would during a traumatic event such as real rape.
In one of the most comprehensive studies of civilizational decline, J.D. Unwin postulates in his book, Sex and Culture, written in 1934, that the main driver for the rise of a civilization is the degree of chastity of the said civilization's women. Unwin, a British social anthropologist at Oxford and Cambridge universities, studied 86 different cultures through 5,000 years of history and found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual restraint they observed.
What is the correlation? Because if it's really weak or non-significant, or if your correlation is not really done properly, it would be meaningless, even if it's positive. There were relatively promiscuous cultures that thrived for quite a long time, such as the ancient Egyptian culture or the pre-Christianity Greco-Roman culture. I would bet that this is probably one of those pseudo-studies that found this from when Europe has already become a superpower, you know, post-Renaissance. So then he looked at all the other cultures comparing to Europe during the height of the European power, and he says, oh, look at all these primitive cultures. The people are so promiscuous, especially the women relative to Western women. Even though the reason really isn't women's sexuality so much as through many factors that Europe got ahead. And I talked about this in my white nationalist video for why this is. And ironically, I think one of the biggest reasons for why Europe eventually got ahead of everybody was due to multiculturalism. It was because, relative to other major civilizations at the time, Europe was more diverse and therefore intercompetition was higher. So you have Italians, Spaniards, French, English, Russians, and Germans, all one of the other, or at the same time, trying to advance knowledge and develop superior technologies to maintain power. And this means sharing and spreading of knowledge in general. And the good ones are being taken up by people all over Europe. Europeans are actually one of the most mixed people on Earth in, I would say, the last 400 years or so. Every white, quote-unquote, white person you will meet will probably tell you that they are, a quarter British, a quarter German, a quarter French, and a quarter Polish or something. On the other hand, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, the most, quote, purebred people actually tend to go extinct pretty fast. And I quote from what he said, "There is not in Europe any such thing as a pure race. Russians have an admixture of Tartar blood, Germans are largely Slavonic, France is a mixture of Celts, Germans, and people of Mediterranean race, Italy the same with the addition of the descendants of the slaves imported by the Romans. The English are perhaps the most mixed of them all. There's no evidence that there is any advantage in belonging to a pure race. The purest race now in existence are the Pygmies, the Hottentots, the Australian Aborigines, the Tasmanians, or probably even purer, are extinct. They were not the bearers of brilliant culture. The ancient Greeks, on the other hand, emerged from an amalgamation of northern barbarians and an indigenous population. The Athenians and the Ionians, who were the most civilized, were also the most mixed. The supposed merits of a racial purity are, it would seem, wholly imaginary. So the current problem with multiculturalism isn't really quote-unquote multiculturalism. What I mean by this is it isn't really trying to get the best ideas from people all over the world to share with each other and to improve society. And this is what the Europeans have done for centuries. But this current multiculturalism is pretty much purely based on a racial policy. So they're letting in tons of people who either don't have anything to contribute to human society, least of all Western society, or they are criminals. That's the problem. The U.S. currently still maintain its status due largely to immigration. Of immigrants filling positions that need to be filled in order for the economy to run. And sure, once they are doing something as drastic as the EU has done, it's going to fall as well if it continues. So this has been said before, but it's really the policies that need to be changed. The problem doesn't fundamentally lie with gender or even quote-unquote multiculturalism, and because it's complicated in both concepts.
By allowing women to fuck freely, the West has de facto entered a matriarchy that disincentivizes young men.
What about letting men to fuck freely? Why wouldn't that disincentivize young women? I mean, are you trying to say that because of biology or whatnot, women are perfectly okay with sharing a partner, and this is still true of today, than men to share their partner? Because, with the shortage of women in China right now, now they are actually trying to recommend that the men from the poor villages to share women. Yeah, this is actually happening. So, is that going to disincentivize women, I wonder? And if so, then it's not a gender issue, is it?
Islam, on the other hand, keeps their women chaste, and their expansive energy, as Unwin's theory predicts, is manifested in what we're observing today.
Actually, when the EU was established, immigration usually came from the poor countries of Europe going into richer countries. If you look at London right now, I went to the centers of London, and most of the workers that I've seen are whites, but they are foreign whites. They're like Italians, Polish, Germans, Romanians, or whatnot. Because now they're free to move around Europe after the European Union has been established. And for the most part, it didn't seem to be a problem from all that I've read. The problem becomes that when they are letting in, these people from the Muslim countries, this is when it started really becoming a problem. And Black Pigeon probably argue that, well, sure, but these Europeans, they're like one big group called the Europeans. But the point I would make would be that the expensive energy that he's talking about has to do with poverty. It has to do with people who are desperate to go into a country and get jobs. If you don't open up the border to Muslim nations, if you open up it to, I don't know, like China or Japan or Korea, and you don't differentiate between people who come in because they have some sort of value skill, you're just letting them in because they're, I don't know, East Asians. Yeah, you're going to see this too. You're going to see a vast, air quote, expensive energy, especially since in Asia, people are running out of places to live. So yeah, they would all flourish into Europe, and they're probably likely to cause problems as well. So once again, doesn't have to do with keeping women in check or whatnot. It has basically everything to do with economy in terms of the expensive energy that he's talking about. In terms of ideology, again, that's another issue because it has to do with the actual effects of these people who coming in into society, and that's different from them, and that's like another very complicated issue. So I'm not going to go through the rest of this video because I've pretty much addressed all the points already. But I do want to say a few more things regarding the debate between Black Pigeon and V. What Black Pigeon said was that he is completely convinced that if women were not given the right to vote, then there will be no multiculturalism. I quote him, he says, absolutely not. And he also said, show me just one country where women weren't given the right to vote and there was multiculturalism. Well, there was one country I can think of on top of my head, which is Israel. Israel gave women the right to vote in 1948, and during that time, the British Mandate Palestinian women certainly didn't have the right to vote before that. And even from the speech of King Hussein of Jordan given in 1943, there was already a huge Jewish immigration that, eventually led to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we see today. Now, I know, that's totally different. This is again what Black Pigeon says to every single one of these objections. He will say, well, the state of Israel wasn't solidly established then, and it wasn't the Arab women who voted the Jews in, it was the Jewish Zionist settlers, etc., etc., etc. Well, this is what I mean. It's also what V was trying to say. Gender doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a complicated multi-factor issue. Just because you don't give the woman the right to vote doesn't mean that there wouldn't be multiculturalism through other factors. The Ottoman Empire was very multicultural for a long time. China had 56 different nationalities, even though vast majority of them are Huns. Egyptians are also one of the most mixed people on the planet, and they thrived for thousands of years. You can just tell how mixed they are by looking at them. They can go from being pretty much a white person to a completely black person. It was also a pharaoh, Khufu, from the 4th dynasty who started to let immigrants in, not women. And although it's true, it's difficult to find a case where there's multiculturalism when women don't have the right to vote, because really women were given the right to vote by the 20th century. Mass immigration problem happened afterwards because of World War II and a bunch of other factors. You can find plenty of cases on the other side though. So there are plenty of countries where women already have the right to vote in a democratic setting or electoral setting, and there is no multiculturalism immigration problem going on. China, for example, has an electoral system, and now more than ever, women are getting into government to have the power to vote for policies. It's now 20%, and it's growing something like 5% or something like, no, sorry, 0.5% like every single year. It's growing. I don't think China is going to have a multicultural problem anytime soon. And you can also just go to Wikipedia and look at each country and when women were given the right to vote, and just count how many countries that currently don't have a multicultural problem right now. And I can guarantee you that what you will find is that more countries exist without multiculturalism problems than there are countries with the problems. So really it's just Europe right now. It's the EU, and like V has said, people already are getting fed up with it. I mean, there are German women who are marching in protest of all this, and the UK has already broken up with the EU. And I'm sure women played a big part in all of this. And I know at this point Black Pigeon will say something like, oh, I don't disagree with you, I'm just saying that women do contribute to this. And he has said this in debate that he believes that it's one of the top 5 factors. You know, I can just tell that he clearly doesn't know statistical modeling of any kind, because if you have, let's say, a multiple regression and you have, let's say, 3 factors that already explain vast majority of the variance, let's say 80%, which has a correlation of 0.9 and above. Just because you're bringing gender and it's going to explain addition, I don't know, 3% more variance, it would be completely meaningless. Because those 3% may be the same as if you bring the factor of, I don't know, animal farming, you know, like the corporation, animal products production, video game playing, of people becoming vegan more and more. So it's not a significant predictor. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a predictor that explains the phenomenon what he's talking about. So anyways, the bottom line is, stop thinking so lazily and try to find a middle ground. Life is complicated, so get with the program.